I'm Denton Davidson for Gold Derby, and I'm here with Alex Pritz, director of Nat Geo's The Territory, about a network of Brazilian farmers seizing a protected area of the Amazon rainforest and a young indigenous leader and mentor fighting back in defense of their land. Alex, this is sort of a broad question to start with, but I'll never understand it. Why are there so many people that still just think we just don't need a rainforest? I mean, it keeps coming up, and you would think it would be one of those things that wouldn't be politically divisive, but here we are. So, what is causing this?
That is the question at the core of so many things right now in the world, I think. And you're right, it shouldn't be political. Like that should be the number one thing, is that living in a habitable planet and being able to survive here for generations to come should not be a political issue. Somehow it's managed to become that. I think in the case of the conflict that we were looking at in Brazil, it's a lot of people who really are just focused on them and theirs, and who agree that the rainforest is a good thing, it's a beautiful thing, it's a national treasure for Brazil, but I just need my little chunk of it here. And then behind these sort of small foot soldiers of colonialism and natural destruction are much larger business owners and people financing this. I didn't speak to too many of them in the making of this film, but I would certainly have some questions for them as well.
How did you become aware of this story in particular, and get contact with the people that are the subjects of this film?
I had read about the work that Nadinha, the activist at the center of our film, had been doing. And when I first heard about her work, it was in the run-up to the elections in Brazil in 2018. And so we were hearing this really divisive, inflammatory, violent rhetoric coming, especially out of then candidate Jair Bolsonaro's camp, that he would do away with the rainforest and that there wouldn't be any more land left for indigenous people. And I saw Nadinha as this 60-year-old woman boldly, proudly standing up in defense of the rainforest, in defense of indigenous rights, and doing it in a part of the world where almost everybody was against her. In the state of Rondônia, where she and Bitete, the young indigenous leader, live, 80% of people voted for Bolsonaro in that 2018 election. And so she was in the lion's mouth, so to speak. And I said, look, I think your work is amazing. It's so inspiring. And I would love to come meet you. I think your life could become a lot more difficult if Bolsonaro wins this election. And I'd like to be there and be part of that with you. And I had no idea it would become a feature film at all. It was just a, kind of one-way ticket type situation, but one thing led to another, and it became obvious that we had a much bigger story on our hands.
What was the most difficult part of just getting down there and shooting, and then also just gaining the trust of the indigenous people that you were allowed to shoot? I mean, that's some of the most incredible footage, is just hearing them tell their stories.
Yeah, I mean, so many different levels of challenge in the making of this film. For one, just the straight up cultural differences between myself as a white American and this indigenous community that have been living with this violent struggle against colonial forces for hundreds of years, generations and generations. Originally, the story was more focused on Nadinha as the activist. As it grew rightly to incorporate this indigenous perspective on the land, I realized the gulf between myself, as an outsider to this community, and their lived experience of it, as well as just the understanding of documentary as a form, was a huge conversation that we needed to have with the Urubau, this indigenous community, who until the 1980s had remained in voluntary isolation from the rest of the Brazilian state. So, the idea of a documentary film, what it's capable of in its, most aspirational form, but also the costs of it. What is a documentary? What does it cost to be part of it? You're giving up a huge amount of privacy. You're giving up, all 8 hours a day. I'm all up in your business. The narrative responsibility to do justice to a community that you're not part of is a huge responsibility to give over to somebody else. I remember when I first arrived in the Urubau community, they make decisions by consensus there. So very different from a film team where you have a hierarchical structure where directors and producers make decisions and other people carry them out. And there was a linguist who had come to try to help record the Uruguay language, which is something that's spoken by in the low thousands of people left on Earth, considered an endangered language. And he had come from UC Berkeley to help write this down so it could be taught in schools. And the elders came together from the 6 different villages and sat and discussed this proposal and came back and said, we're really not that into this, because we know what happens when people like you come in and write down our knowledge. You'll own our language and then we'll have to pay to speak it. And we're not interested in that. And I think for me, that was a really important early wake up call that I, as an outsider who looks a lot like this other linguist, who behaves culturally like all these other people who have come and taken so much from this community, stolen and exploited so many aspects of their culture and heritage and land, that this idea of narrative autonomy was going to be really, really crucially important to the making of this film. And can talk more about that in other ways. When COVID came, we had a huge challenge, but also found that to be an opportunity to expand the way that we were telling this story to, become a co-production with the Indigenous Uruguay people. And, that opened up a lot of new creative possibilities for us.
One of the things the Indigenous people talked about was back when, white people made first contact, they brought with them disease and wiped out over half the population. So with COVID and some of that coming into this, was that sort of another thing that they were concerned about? Because they're in a very specific area of Earth. And as you describe it so perfectly in the film, it's an island of rainforest now surrounded by farms that's being protected for now. So was that sort of a concern of, what are these people going to bring into our community?
Yeah, absolutely. So just for context, for the average viewer who may or may not have seen the film, the Uruguay are a group of 183 Indigenous people that are defending a massive area of old growth rainforest, 2.5 times the size, the state of Delaware. That's how big their land is. You can see it from outer space as this dark green island of rainforest surrounded by farms. And it's really a barrier to the rest of the Amazon rainforest, and acts as a sort of bellwether for the rest of these destructive forces. So, they were forcibly contacted and assimilated, the Uruguay, by the Brazilian state in 1981. And that was a really violent process for them. More than half their population died, largely from communicable diseases like tuberculosis and measles. And so the idea of foreign pathogens brought by outsiders loomed large in the collective consciousness, especially for the elders who had lived through this early 80s period of real violence. And the Uruguay, to their credit and to Bitate's credit, the young protagonist of our film, took COVID really seriously and said, nobody into or out of our territory until we know what the hell's going on. Like, we didn't know if it was a vaccine or what at that point. Nobody had any idea. And so we obviously respected that decision. But we had this conundrum on our hands where prior to that, we had been doing a lot of the filming as, myself and another cinematographer. And so we had to just start a discussion and say, do we keep going? Do we have enough footage? Do we start the edit? Where are we? And the message we got back from the Indigenous community was, no, we're not done. And we can do this. Help us get better cameras, help us get better audio equipment. We've got it from here. And we can shoot, produce, direct, manage footage for, this final chapter, this final arc of their story.
And there's moments, of terror at some points. I mean, there's moments where the activist Nadina's daughter was sort of threatened to be kidnapped. These people are under constant attack and sort of supervision. How emotional was that for you as a filmmaker? And were those moments things you expected, or what was it like to just be there in sort of those moments that were shocking to watch? Yeah,
the moment you're describing where Nadina's daughter, somebody calls saying that they've kidnapped her, it turns out to be a false scare, just an intimidation tactic, but that happens every 6 months or so to Nadina. And so we were there through multiple episodes of this. The real violence that you see in the film came as a shock to me. We understood that this was an active conflict, that this was, a situation where violence was a real possibility. But when it happens in the way that it did in our film to somebody that we were all so close to, is it leaves a huge hole. It's not one person. The person in our film who was murdered was a father, a family member, a teacher in a local Indigenous school, and so that hole is something that I think has yet to really be filled or rebuilt for our film team and for the Indigenous community as well.
Talk a little bit about Bitate and what his legacy is. And I mean, he was such a young man to be held up in such a place. I believe he was 19 when he sort of was put in charge of leading the charge to save this piece of land for his whole community.
Yeah, Bitate as an 18-year-old took on the mantle of responsibility for the Uruwao. He became their leader, and it was the first time they'd ever had somebody so young come into that leadership role. But it was really, everybody felt it was necessary because the tools that they needed to engage with in their fight were tools that the elders didn't feel fully equipped to handle. And Bitate, as a young person who was active on the internet, engaged in the media, understood the power of story and digital media, was able to harness, drones and GPS and walkie-talkies and all of these tools to advance his community's surveillance capabilities. The rainforest is really dense, it's thick, it takes a long time to walk through it if there's no path already. But with a drone, he could take that up and get aerial footage of a deforestation site, send that back to the public prosecutor, and try to get some action from the state, much, much more easily. And it was also this interesting thing where these invasions on their territory have been happening for a really long time. The state has been trying to ignore it, saying, oh, that's just a hearsay, word of mouth, whatever. But translating, their righteous complaints about these invasions into kind of Western empirical terms, metadata tagged photos and everything else, forced the state to reckon with it in a really different way. And that eventually caused the downfall of this particular association of farmers who were seeking to invade their territory.
Such an eye-opening documentary. And Alex, congratulations on The Territory. And people can see that on Nat Geo, and it'll be streaming, I believe, on Hulu and Disney Plus in the future. So good luck with everything moving forward.
Thanks, Denton.